you wanted to dive into underscore protocol, it's there. It's also in the Mattermost on the Tech We Trust channel.
Awesome.
It's just another thing is I'm going to Toronto this summer to visit my sister in Rochester. So it would be fun if you can share some insights on the city or something. Or
Cool.
maybe meet in person, it would be great.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Actually, I'm meeting up. There's a meetup in Toronto tonight with Connor, who's also from the Holochain team, but it's actually for the Toronto Mesh group. So like mesh networking and some of the people organizing the decentralized web camp that's in July, which I hope to attend. But that's out in San Francisco.
Does that have something to do with WISPs?
WISPs? I don't know what that is.
All right.
You said that's tonight, Robert?
Yeah, tonight.
Let's try and get the basic data structure that we have, and then you could take it and explore other questions that might be useful to answer about mesh networks.
Oh, you mean like the different actors in that sort of global network? I think somebody's actually going to be bringing what's called the Libra router, which was kind of an open source mesh networking router. So it's kind of a piece of hardware that we're going to be playing with, I think.
Here's the kind of questions that the identity group wants to answer. So think about that list of questions, but in the context of mesh networks.
Okay, well, I think maybe I derailed things a little bit by sort of asking about the underscore protocol, but I think, is it, I don't actually know how to pronounce it. Is it Peppo? Oh, you're muted.
It's Peppo, more naturally, but don't worry, I won't take it.
Well, the underscore protocol seems like a map to me. It's like a way to, it seems like a lot of the FedWiki stuff too, where you're able to take a conversation, fork it, make your own, but leave attributions in the right place. It's a really interesting. I'm fascinated.
We're making the first prototypes, but the white paper, well, the work with the white paper went good with PGM, the person I've been working with. So.
Should we do a quick round of introductions? I think Peppo and Robert got to introduce themselves, but.
I'll just say, Peppo, we met yesterday. Great presentation. Really appreciated that. That was very, very interesting. And I may have to bounce out. I've got something else on, but here as long as it can be. Hi.
Thank you.
Mariette or Lauren?
Mariette?
Sure. Hi, Beppo. I'm a writer working with a few different concepts regarding where we are in evolution. That's primarily my interest, and my interest is in biomimicry as it relates to the soil, and and all of that is what I'm paid for by a group called Just One Organics. And so that's the #1 focus. My background is in poetry and fine art, and also in any type of liberation politic. So that's generally my thing. I'm the daughter of immigrants, including refugees. So I'm highly political, but I try and pretend that I'm not. But that's exactly where I'm at and why I thrive, because I see Christina laughing. It makes me happy, and why I cannot stay away from this wonderful group. So I'm looking at your tech. I've signed up for the emailer on the forum. I like it. It looks very interesting. So hello.
Hi, I'm Lauren, and I am currently obsessing over this new idea of what I'm terming like wedding tech, which is I'm trying to think of like how do you kind of onboard people to a overall network, like a kind of a network of networks, and how do you do it in really smart ways? So how do you do an intake that actually means something, that's not like stupid profiles that you see everywhere? How do you kind of put people together into groups? How do you connect them? How does something like this group form, and why is it so good? I don't really know why, but what I want to do is kind of figure out how we bring in mapping, like professional mapping, to this equation. Like if we're looking at the network as a whole, say which groups in DigiLife are kind of lacking something. What are they lacking? How can we shuffle people around like these are wedding tables, and so everyone gets in a group that feels good to them? And how can we create that algorithm with people who are like a diverse group of people, you know, like wedding planners from India or women from Africa who can kind of like, or, you know, socialites from Manhattan who can kind of like give us insight on creating an algorithm for putting people together. So that's kind of what I'm obsessed with this week.
We definitely need to talk more. You and I. Mariette, with your introduction, I wanted to make sure that you'd seen a fascinating kind of dialogue that's going on between Jem Bendell and Jeremy Lent around Jem's deep adaptation paper, where he's like, collapse is inevitable, we're screwed. And Jeremy Lent said that's an unhelpful framing, and this is why, and he calls it deep transformation instead. And they've had a little bit of a back and forth. So the Patterns of Meaning blog that Jeremy posts, he has his most recent thing on there has links to all three of the, like, Jem's original paper, his response, Jem's response, and then his second response. So
I love that, and I'll look at that.
you're gonna like it, yeah.
Yeah. Look, I'll just jump in and say that essentially I think that apocalypse is a very masculine perspective. And it is, you know, because it's a point of privilege and self-pity. And you know, and I've engaged in it as well because I'm also influenced by the patriarchal system. So I'm no, like, you know, stranger to my own, you know, participation in this, especially several years ago. But I do continue to believe that it's, you know, in terms of Lauren's comment, just to cycle both of these other female comments together, if you think about a wedding, even as it occurs these days, there might be like 4 parents of the bride and a bunch of different people, and there are all these mixed families and identities. And the idea of even binaries is like not real in terms of how we socialize anymore. And then the other aspect of that too is like within that, you know, how do you get people to socialize? Well, there's usually an event or a technology. Like we're here, at least from my perspective, because Holochain began to exist. And so there was something sort of tangible and catalyzing. So if one's expecting it to come from goodwill, I doubt it. Goodwill coupled with self-interest and engagement and excitement for something new, yes. But again, you know, I've given up on these ideas that people show up just because they know that they're about to be extinct in the way that they're about to be extinct. No, it's just not enough, you know? And so, so that's, thank you for that. And I'll find that in the channel, because I think that's really it. And I do find it interesting that everybody's on apocalypse right now. And extinction.
Well, I really loved the way Jeremy moved past it very quickly. Also, because of what you just said about apocalypse, the interview around, I think it's called "Awake in the Age of Monsters," by it's Daniel Thorson, who's amazing. He lives at the Monastic Academy in Vermont, a monastic academy for the preservation of life on Earth, Maple, and he's interviewing Vinay Gupta, and Vinay says, you know, apocalyptic religions are a massive problem in our consciousness right now. So, you know, and lots more. You'll like that one too.
And super
Yeah,
someone's got to engage with the process of dying and kind of go off from the superorganism, personally.
but the engagement is critical. I've got to say, in the discussion between Bent and Bendel, I go very Bent. I've a sense that the things that drive Trump's populism work just as well on this end of the spectrum. And Mr. Bendel, and I decline to call him professor, is very adept at taking a position and making a lot of noise in a very populist process. And he's got an enormous amount of comfort and joy in this process. In the community currency movement, he was a wet blanket of no significant value for about 10 years. He's not good. God, that's on record. Sorry about that. No, not really sorry about that.
It's so funny because I see them arguing, and my experience of his deep adaptation paper, which is my first experience of GEM, was total relief, because I've been in this state since, you know, I was 16 and heard Jean-Michel Cousteau get really mad at Exxon Valdez and talk about oil and climate and where we're going. And that's been like my context as an environmental scientist, and like going through school and learning about climate change and learning about the feedback loops and really understanding the white reflecting sunlight away and then permafrost melting and all of the possibilities. And I wanted people to freak out in 2003.
Hey,
and now they finally are, and so I'm finding it relieving instead of concerning. I'm like, yes.
I'm way ahead of you on that, Christina. It was 1969 I started realizing we were in an apocalyptic situation. And I was in a desperate state for 13 years until the early 80s. And then I realized what money had to do with all this shit and what could be done about it. And for the last 30-something years, I've been in a different state of despair about people's accessibility.
Money.
Yeah, like how do you get ideas through a culture? And the thing about Jem is he's desperate to be on TV, any TV. He's just a follower of fashion and wants to be up there as the voice piece, the man with the banner and so on. And he's found a brilliant place in this adaptation thing. It's perfect for his style and psyche. It'll work very well. And he'll do a good job. He will raise people's attention very well. So I'm all good. I'm glad he's gone there.
One of the things that was really interesting about Jeremy's response was that he was saying, like, this is fundamentally maintaining the separation of human and nature.
Yeah.
And because we're going through a perspective shift, I feel like both of those responses are necessary.
Oh, yes.
Jem is able to get through to people who may not otherwise listen. Well, people like Jeremy who are coming, like when you have made the shift from nouns to verbs, from isolation and separation to we are nature, then you can listen to the deep transition language much more effectively. But folks who are speaking from that paradigm often don't get across to people who are in the split already. So I actually find both of them very generative. Like I see the argument as kind of.
I think it's necessary. It's good to see it. It's the rubber is hitting the road, or the shit is hitting the fan, or something. And But it's just in the position of what is a positive activist position to take. I'm much less comfortable with Bendel's write it off attitude. I think Bendel is missing the point, as are many people in this field. They're just throwing up their hands and saying it's hopeless, there are no silver bullets, there's nothing can be done, sit down and kiss your ass goodbye. And I think it's really simplistic and negative and mistaken. So, end of rant. Sorry, I got a rant occasionally. A lot.
So I'm wondering if we could have Robert show MetaMaps and, you know, talk about something, whatever we talk about. Just, I would love, Peppo, to see you use that during a conversation. Oh, look at you, you're fast.
I'm muted. Okay. It's hard to capture everything, but it's sort of a visualization of who's in this room and sort of who's referencing what. And so technically this is real-time collaborative. So if anybody with a MetaMaps account wanted to hop on, we could map together. But basically you can double click anywhere to create a node. We have these different node types, which we call metacodes. They're kind of like these abstract glyphs that represent different things. So this set that I'm using here is just a subset of the larger set of kind of these metacodes. And yeah, you can draw a connection between things and label the connection. You can also if you double click on any existing node, you can add some metadata such as a link and a little description, markdown description. And the other neat thing is there's many maps on MetaMaps. So if I typed in here, I don't know, collective intelligence and started typing, it should, yeah, you can pull up existing nodes from other maps and sort of, so it's truly the same node, although you can have multiples with the same name. So these are all, you can see, these are all different people that have created it. It gives you a little piece of metadata on how many other maps it's on and how many connections it's on. Here. I can actually, yeah, I can send, if you don't have an account, it's kind of in an invite only stage, and it's sort of been on the back burner because it was mostly Connor Turland who's been building it and knows all the inner workings of what he calls spaghetti code, so it sort of needs refactored and redone. But there's a link if anyone wants to join, and then I'll also share the link to this map itself into our ecosystem mapping call channel. So actually, Connor and I have been experimenting recently on, there's actually a mode, so on MetaMaps right now, it's kind of everything's placed exactly where you placed it. There are no algorithmic layouts to it in the way that, say, Kumu would have with the more organic sort of force-directed. But we've been playing, this is just a really quick experiment with a JavaScript library called SiteEscape that in terms of bringing, so the point of this is to have like a conversation and have replies to replies, and then if I click on anything, I can reply to it, and that's sort of what's happened here. But what's neat is we do have a layout algorithm underneath it, meaning just say I wanted to reply to this kind of hack. You can set what's called the focal node, like where you want to focus, and if I submit, it rearranges the map so that you see sort of in context the broader conversation in context of what you're about to reply to. So you can see like who's already replied to it, and so ideally in the near future, it'll all sort of, you click on something and it'll dynamically transition. We won't have these like little boxes, but that's just something else. I don't know. There's a chat window for every map. And yeah, so anyways, I'll stop talking. That's a quick demo of it. Yeah, at this point, it hasn't been moving forward, but we do have sort of much broader ideas for where we want to take it. We just haven't had time or resources to direct attention into it. Although maybe some of that will be reinvigorated with some of the mapping team stuff that's happening within the Digital Life Collective. We'll see.
Nice, great. It's really good.
Oh,
Don't know how, I mean,
actually, I shouldn't have stopped. I shouldn't have stopped screen sharing.
I don't want to take too much of the conversation, but this looks, I mean, the visual representation looks really useful, and I wonder, yeah, you have this maps level, and you have assumed this only is graphic, and yes, I wonder if you could like create like sub maps of maps, something like that, or connect one map to another map. But you can in a way, because one node can be in two maps at the same time. So this seems related with the Unscript protocol. That may be a summary, right? So you can, if you want to learn more about the Unscript protocol, instead of me going on it, you can check the video of yesterday's call. At the end of it, around 40 minutes from the beginning. At the beginning, I presented collective one, which has some structure, but from minute 40, I went into the Unscript protocol, and maybe you will see how it would relate with this.
And I would say I've only played with it initially, the affordances of metamaps, but I am interested in how we can use it to sort of grow a dynamic agenda in a sort of meeting like this so that everybody can be working in parallel rather than having to take the sort of audio channel. So I'm curious if ever it looks like a bunch of us are on the map, we could propose sort of like where we want to go next on the map, and then sort of move towards this sort of center sort of what we want to talk about next. And then, yeah.
Well, I like this wormhole aspect of the mapping, and I think that's actually really important. You know, maps nested within maps or wormholes, essentially, as far as I'm seeing them. Perhaps a bad term, but still, they kind of let you go deep in real fast into what a person or a topic might be about. And that layered meaning has always been, I think, one of the things that's really interesting to me about this type of dynamic mapping that you all have introduced me to. Because that's how my mind, and I think a lot of minds work on the internet. You know, we want to be able to dive deep as quickly as possible. So I have a little experience working with Robert over the past year, and I really enjoy it in how it's been developing. Just want to say that.
Oh, and I didn't actually notice because I didn't make a sound, but I think Jerry joined us. And I've been screen sharing, so I didn't notice.
On tiptoe, my apologies. I was in the other room, kind of hanging out, going, "This isn't right."
How's it going?
Not too bad, thank you.
Do you want to do a quick introduction for Peppo, who's with us for the first time?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Peppo. I'm Jerry Mikulski. I grew up in South America, for what that's worth. So my first 12 years, así que hablo español, por si acaso.
Okay.
And I've been mind mapping. Pardon?
Yo no sabía.
Ah, sí, de veras. Lima 10 años, Buenos Aires 2 años. Back in the day, a couple months before we left Buenos Aires, the things were starting to turn south. 5 guys with guns held us up at home. Yeah, it was interesting. And anyway, since then, I've done lots of different things. I was a tech industry trends analyst for 12 years. And in the middle of that, a little company called The Brain came by. And so I've been a mind mapper for 21 years. and you can go browse my mind map at jerrysbrain.com. There's a little text link that says Launch Jerry's Brain. Click on that. It'll take you into the brain that I fed this morning. And then a third sort of thing is my topic is trust. So I realized at the same time roughly that the brain shows up in my life, I realized that I hate the word consumer. I follow that thread for a long time, and it leads me to trust. So the general thesis is that we lost trust in humans years ago somehow. We then handed the world over to mostly white guys to design systems for efficiency, scale, and mostly profit. They proceeded to create coercive systems everywhere that are not the best systems we could have. And in the meantime, I discovered hundreds of movements around the world, like open source software, Wikipedia, microfinance, that are doing what I call design from trust. So I'm trying to figure out, what does design from trust look like? How do we foster it, create it, propagate it in the world?
Nice to meet you, Jerry. Sounds great. I was looking at your mind map from this morning.
Cool. Yeah, you're going to have mind map overdose today.
Yeah, it's amazing people that I am meeting now. Yeah, great. Nice to meet you.
Same here.
Jerry, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Because I noticed this too, and maybe somebody else has too, but you seem to be pretty good at monitoring the media, especially in this country, I noticed. And it's interesting because, you know, I have all these family members who are all about the alt-right because they don't seem to, I don't know, they're scared to death. I mean, I understand why they're scared to death. It still doesn't justify it. But anyway, so they were like watching Fox News, right? And I see that the far right, the right is now like pushing this like antitrust, anti-tech agenda, which I find really, really interesting because they want privacy, but of course the sort of push and the underlying push is then censorship that they're going for. And so I'm wondering if anyone else is noticing this really interesting, really a little bit scary sort of they're borrowing some of the language and they're borrowing some of this but yet they're putting it out there in this incredibly toxic way. So I'm curious actually as to if you've noticed that too.
Well, yeah, it's unavoidable. It's kind of hard to miss the shift to the far right and what language is being co-opted. There's also general backlash against tech from the left and the right. So yesterday, Tristan Harris launched a new movement, basically trying to say, "Hey, the tech companies are hurting us." And he's anything but alt-right. You know, he's pretty much on the left, but he's coming at it saying, "Hey, we built the wrong platforms. This is hurting us." So I think there's a bunch of it. And then I spent some time yesterday reading the article about China's surveillance technologies being sold to other countries like Ecuador. Did anybody else read that New York Times piece? The video in the piece is excellent. And basically it describes how during the Beijing Olympics, backstage, China was busy selling technology. They were basically holding a trade show at the same time as the Olympics was going on, because there were delegations from all the countries of the world showing up. And they were like, "Hey, we've got all this, you know, we've got cameras everywhere and we have software that can monitor your citizens. And look, we can clamp down on protests. And wouldn't you like to buy one? And oh, you don't have any cash? That's great. We like your oil. So we will lend you a bunch of money in exchange for your oil, but you still have to pay us back the money." And if anybody's ever read Confessions of an Economic Hitman back in the day, the worst read, most interesting book about worst written, rather, most interesting book about this kind of, you know, backdoor deals, you'll see that what you end up with is your country in debt to somebody and your natural resources plundered, et cetera, et cetera. So that seems to be what China's doing, you know, next alongside with One Belt, One Road and a bunch of other things. So that appeals to authoritarian populists around the globe. Right, around the globe. So not just Ecuador, but lots of countries.
There are plenty of authoritarian populists on the left as much as the right too. I want to be clear that I'm not insane on that because, or that I'm not ignorant on that, because I really don't trust anybody who's on the formal left really anymore. I only trust grassroots organizations that allow people to create their own relationships. Anything that's too organized is not interesting anymore. It's corrupt. i.e. the DNC in this country.
Yeah,
The Blue Church.
the Blue Church.
Excuse my language today, but honestly, and you've never heard me use the F word before on there, but like, no, never once. I've watched myself. Other expletives, yes. But I have really, like, the Blue Church is so absolutely part of the fall, and I know there's a reformation within that. But again, it's like, what are we reforming? It's their structures are inept, and they're not adaptive, and they're hierarchical. And so there is no real way to reform them except to completely let them collapse or to infiltrate them through technology, because that's the only little thing that their grubby little hands that will get, is if you give them a little golden key, which is why China did so well. Nobody liked China. Nobody trusted China. They just went there. And I mean, that particular in Olympic Games, if the movement of the torch and the way that people were abused and silenced during the movement of the torch wasn't metaphorically powerful enough for people to understand what was going on, I'm shocked. I still am. Because that movement of that torch was indicative of the fall of the people globally. Because every single place where it went, including the United States, for a quote unquote hostile power, we actually jailed our own people.
And so China is a juggernaut, and I think very, very hard to intercept on its own terms. Mm-hmm. So looking back in the US, this is a thought I put in just a couple days ago. 10 days ago, I was at a conference in Boulder, sitting in the audience listening to a panel about Generation Z, and realizing there's some really smart young people on the panel. I see really smart young people coming together for the Parkland shooting, for Greta Thunberg and the climate strikes, the kids walking out of school. I really like Pete Buttigieg for president, so he's here. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the young women in Congress right now. The idea that Medicare for all and a couple other things are actually, and the Green New Deal are actually in the conversation. So I'm suddenly realizing that we could be at a generational tipping point where things like the New Deal was a tipping point back in Roosevelt's day during the Great Depression. And the Great Depression kind of made room for the New Deal, which all conservatives have hated for all time. And conservatives since the New Deal have tried to undermine and destroy the New Deal ever since. The same way they've tried to get rid of Obamacare in the last couple of years, unsuccessfully. So we could focus on China's taking over the world, because I actually think that this is the China millennium is coming up, and it's not new. It's not new news, because before 1750, before the Industrial Revolution really hits its stride, 95% of the world's GDP equivalent is produced by India and China, and nobody gives a damn about what comes out of Europe. The Americas are not trading with anybody, etc. So. They're just sort of barely coming into being. Anyway, long digression, but all interesting topics. Thank you for the juicy question.
I don't think it's a digression, because they've already used their face technology to ban 1 million passports.
Mm-hmm.
1 million, at least.
I wanted to give Peppo context that this brain map that we just saw, Jerry has been building that for 20 years. And Eric had a question in the chat.
Please. I am pasting some links for Robert, and Eric says, the brain has very nice text search. So I just name, each node in the brain is called a thought. All I do is name the thoughts, and I don't use, the brain does have types and tags as special features. I do not use those special features because I found that they were just confusing to me. So there's a link to the 2020 generational tipping point, and then let me give you a link also to China exporting surveillance. There we go. And the inventor of the brain just did something that was sort of an upgrade, but what it does is it's giving me a 4-second wait before I can do things, which is unpleasant.
You when you get a chance, give the Jordan Greenhall link too.
Oh, good. So here's this, and let's go back to Jordan.
And I would love it if we could do a quick round and just talk about, I'm fascinated by sharing maps during actual conversations and the difference that people have around how that helps or how it hinders understanding and communication.
I would love to know the answer to that too.
I would love to just hear thoughts from everybody on the call. Just do a quick round if we can. Anybody want to start?
Well, for me, it's a matter of perspective. I don't know if you remember the Godel Isher Bach book about, and they've got this graphic of a cube that you look at it one scale, it's a G. Somebody's going to do it for me. Sure. How you look at something, what you see, what you map is a question of where you're looking from. Too often, of course, maps are two-dimensional, which is a severe restriction on their information. And it tends to box us into what the mapper wants to show, which may be different from what the observer should be gleaning from it, maybe gleaning from it. And so that's the problem I'm finding is the mix between the perspective of the creator and the reader. I mean, I can show you what's in my mind. Does that get into yours?
Jerry, can I ask that we stop screen share while we're doing this round?
You bet.
Thanks. Who wants to go next? Eric.
Yeah, hi everybody. Yeah, I feel like when it's in a meeting, it could be a bit of information overload, but sometimes it does provide context. But I think we could get distracted by all the branches going off and all the tangents. I did start using the brain, and it helped me organize my thoughts for an article that I wrote recently. And I found the process of organizing the thoughts was very valuable, but I didn't need to refer to it. I didn't really need to structure the article exactly as I had mapped it. So I think, yeah, just keep that in mind, that it's a great tool, but yeah, you really use your judgment going forward. And it's great that I could come back and review the details later. Okay.
I think it's interesting because it allows for a type of engagement with the visual poetic, which creates a type of resonance field for me. So in that regard, I know where it could be overwhelming if one is attempting to sort of engage with like an efficacy model in terms of how one processes information. But if one's looking at an experiential model for looking within something and for actually being able to see a topography, a geography of sorts, emotional, et cetera, richness and depth, then I think what it does is it creates that level of depth that to me is more compelling than an intellectual argument alone. And that's partially because of how I guess I'm individually structured, but from a brain perspective, it's actually stimulating a more complete brain experience for the individual. So I think it's a matter of adaptation and sort of evolutionary acceleration within information sharing and grasp and cognition.
If I can just jump in for a second, Maria, what you just said reminded me of something, which is that I always think of language. My kind of metaphor for us speaking to each other, trying to communicate ideas, is that we each have a little paintbrush, and I'm busy trying to paint in your head something with like watercolors as they bleed and fade. And my idea of what red is probably different from your idea of red when I hit your brain and you start forming ideas. And so language is this serial, strictly serial little channel where I'm trying to paint images in everybody's head at the same time, for better or worse. And each of us brings our own context, history, bias, triggers, whatever. And by screen sharing, at the great risk of sensory overload, I'm trying to add dimensionality, depth, background, history, context to the little thready watercolors that I'm busy painting. And I really like the effect, but I'm very aware of Christina's great question, which is it can totally screw conversations up. It can in fact be distracting, all those other things. But I like it because I feel like I've crafted a thing that is a network of ideas that is sensible when other people see it. And if I can share that while painting, it might enrich the whole experience. And the collection of nodes, like the one I just showed about the tipping point, the generational tipping point, to me, the aggregation of evidence often triggers emotional responses that are really useful. Because like, oh shit, I forgot about that thing and that thing and that thing, and you get worked up about it more than me just talking.
Somebody else want to go? Michael? Lauren, Peppo, Robert? We can't see that, Michael.
It's a collection of quick graphics of what is a bicycle. What is a bicycle? I had a class of undergrads for an hour on anthropology, and I wanted to point out that we don't see what we see. We don't see what we don't see. I gave them a minute to draw a bicycle, knowing that it had 2 wheels, handlebars, cranks, and a seat. And of the 60 propositions, only 4 or 5 were functionally possible in any form and shape. And this is a community that rides bicycles, uses bicycles, sees bicycles, but cannot reconstruct from their internal mindset what a bicycle bloody well is. Now, that's most of our problem with mapping through the mind, is that what we've got in our mind is the watercolors bleeding gently off in all directions in so many times. And to try and find these mergers between our perceptions, our mappings, is utterly, it's the big conflict. How do we know what we're looking at? How do we know what we're looking at?
I'm trying to follow. I have a couple of things I might want to say. So one thing is this information exchanging process between people. These tools forces you to digitalize it, and not just because you go into the digital tool, but because you create like symbols from a finite set. So there are words, and you can only select combinations, limited combination of words. But it seems that the actual information that you want to exchange is sort of analog. It's like it cannot be described with a very limited number of symbols. So the example that Michael described of the bicycle, you could, if you define as infinite, so like infinite sets to define what is a bicycle, so the number of wheels, number of metal bars, a shape of the bars, angles, and you ask them to describe them, then maybe you will have the same definition. But if you leave it as an analog communication channel, which is paper graph, well, there is going to be like differences, and so the exchange of information between brains, you use digital. Even if you are talking, you are using sort of digital channel because you use words from a limited set. But it seems like the underlying thing that is happening is more analog. This is so it's not, you cannot feel the entire set and transfer the entire idea ever, because you can transfer it like 10 times with different words and it will create different images.
Yeah, it's about co-creation. Like we can't push a map into somebody else's head. But what you may do is emerge a map from the collaboration of many participants. The other method is hopeless.
And for using these plots, maybe they can help. I see them as a help too. The other thing is that conversations, well, you leave recording, so you leave a trace. You're recording now. That's one part. But then you could help instead of listening the entire conversation, use this map. And maybe something I think it was mentioned yesterday, you can go to one link and automatically jump into the second of the call in which we were talking about a subject. So it's an easy way, like a content table of the conversation. That's it.
Lauren and Robert, is anybody else not gone?
Does anyone remember that guy from Holochain who was interested in creating layered maps, where you can basically kind of like connected with a database and you can see different mapping views depending on what information you needed? I think that would be incredibly helpful in terms of, like, I would love to be able to set the information and then be able to see like two factors or two things that I'm looking for, like in a network or something, but be able to set the parameters of the map, not just make maps that people see. So I would love to be able to take a database and see it how I need to see it and navigate how I need to navigate it, and have an interface that I like and pleases me, so that maybe two people could view a set of information in completely different ways that make sense to them.
Can you relate that to the question about how does screen sharing during, like live, real time, during conversations help or hinder, or both?
I think they do, because I'm a visual learner, so it's hard for me to intake things through my ears. So it actually helps me remember if I can see the connections and hear it at the same time.
Robert?
Well, I think there's a lot of potential in the practice of sort of screen sharing and having a sort of an object of focus, rather than, well, in some sense, we're all sitting in front of slot machines right now while trying to have a conversation, and we're looking at screens, and that if we're clicking links at any time, we could go off in our own rabbit holes. So I think, but even in the sort of physical space, if somebody's presenting with a set of slides, it still has the same sort of effect. Somebody could start reading the words you have on the slides instead of saying or listening to what you're saying. So it's not exactly like it's something brand new. It's just that these maps and the fact that we're sitting in front of a computer means it's a whole lot more interactive. But yeah, that's where I think some of the potential is, as I was saying earlier, to sort of take in people's desires for the conversation, or sort of where they're at, how they're feeling, what they're thinking about, as like multiple channels coming into a shared space at once, rather than having one person, currently me, talking. And but I don't know, I guess the other thing there is, I guess we would have to get better as groups as intentionally shifting modes. So I frequently reference something from the metacurrency world called game shifting, which is just this idea that we could make explicit our group process. And maybe we intentionally say, okay, we're in like one speaker mode and everybody's trying to just listen. We're not trying to take notes, or we're not trying to do anything other than listen. Or maybe there's other modes that we have names for, and it's called game shifting because those modes would be like games that we sort of polymorphically transition as a group between them, and that we would, through doing this in the practice, we get to know which modes are good for what challenges, which circumstances, and sort of apply those to those circumstances. And I don't know, I feel like I'm somewhat rambling now, but that the digital tools would be useful as sort of a dashboard for putting these explicit group processes up on, and maybe even taking in feedback like, oh, I'm distracted, I'm going to sort of send that signal to the shared dashboard that we have this one place that we're focusing on. Yeah. And the other thing I was going to say is, obviously, with how the webcams work. A speaker in person can track everyone's eyes, and that is super useful. Where here we don't know what everyone is looking at. So it'd be interesting to sort of, I know I know Zoom has a feature where you can have multiple people screen sharing. So it'd be interesting if everyone had to screen share at the same time. So, and instead of sharing our webcams, everyone's showing what they're currently looking at on their screens.
Doesn't that become infinite regress if everybody's looking at Zoom? So, were you going to say something else, Robert? I'm just fascinated because I come from so many different contexts where people don't want you to put anything in the chat asynchronously, so you can deeply listen, where people are sharing all the time. And in this particular call, this has been such a really interesting generative space because we don't have any sort of agenda. It's just a community of mappers call. I usually can track a lot and don't get distracted very easily. I can just sort of multi-thread. I find it really disruptive and jarring when somebody starts the screen share without consent, without like asking, is this okay right now? So I love the idea of game shifting and like really intentionally saying, right now we're deeply listening and nobody's even doing chat. The default mode for this group seems to be like asynchronous chat just keeps the conversation richer. So maybe that's our default. But I would really like the screen share, especially when you don't have the boundary that Lauren was just talking about. I don't screen share map with groups unless we actually have a clear boundary question, because I do systems mapping, strategic mapping. So we're really clear about like, what are we mapping before we go and dive into a map, because I'm not doing conversation maps or brain maps or whatever, unless I'm in that mode with probably one other person. I'm fascinated by that. And Jerry, there's no apologies. It's fascinating to me because it's usually like I find myself jarring other people in a place where I find it like that. So I think it gives me empathy for how people experience information overload from me. So, oh, awesome. Thank you, Eric. I love how you use chat. Is there, Robert, from your knowledge of game shifting, is there like some clear things that we could try out next week?
Yeah. Well, we could. Well, one thing I feel like we've sort of named, or we would have to name games, but basically maybe we could have a mode where it is just like, I don't know, no, don't use your hands. Let's just focus on who's speaking entirely, and don't worry about capturing it. It's all okay if that isn't captured, or maybe it's just being recorded. So if you really like, you don't need to stress about that. That's a part of why I like to record, is like, yeah, you can sort of relax a little bit and feel like, oh, I don't need to capture this wonderful conversation. It's like, it's gonna be okay. But yeah, I'll share some links as well. There's a web page that sort of details how it's been done in the past, but always with like physical whiteboards. So there's actually Joachim's talk time is sort of a little step of the way towards some sort of dashboard for this, but I don't know of other sort of more intentional sort of software tools that are made for this deliberate game shifting practice. Oh, and yeah, for the videos that I felt are okay to Eric's question, that are okay to upload publicly, yeah, it's just my personal YouTube, and a bunch of them are just unlisted, so they'll get shared in the Mattermost channels for the people that were either involved or should be aware, but there's a few that I've made actually public, so they'll be discoverable on the web, I guess. I guess that's a question for this group, is everyone okay that the videos from the ecosystem mapping calls are public, or would you prefer that they just stay unlisted? Yes, I could ask a more explicit question. I guess thumbs up if public's okay. Okay. I see a nod. Okay, cool. That's cool.
I just want to just point out the fact that what we're talking about in terms of group cohesion is not group obeisance. So what I enjoy about, for lack of a simpler word, but or group duty to be uniform. How's that? So again, I think that part of the pervasive mindset is that effectiveness comes from everybody doing everything in lockstep. And I think that that's a kind of authoritarian old model. Like, again, if we're attempting to, move the widget from A to C, and we have to move that widget right now, okay, perhaps a little different. But if we're in an exploratory or more philosophical or sort of organizational design mode, then what we are like losing when we look at things from a purely linear and single-minded, are we all together perspective, is that we're losing variety within the way that humans behave. So can Christina's attention be split into a few different places at the same time and still be effective for her? The answer is yes. Can somebody else not be able to do anything but really focus in on what they're hearing, and that creates an efficiency for them? Then that answer is yes. So in terms of engagement and participation, I would just caution the group to not think that it is a failure if people are somehow showing their variability and their variation. I'm super on fire with this today, because I think that is that again is this kind of, I watched this, I'll just say the last thing. I watched this Nina Paley sadomasochism movie the other night. I don't know if I'm gonna put it up here, because I've been waiting for someone to help me figure out what's a great visual for how the monotheistic major Western religion screwed up. And yet to do it in a way that feels really compassionate and loving towards history. And Nina Paley did what, her name is escaping me now, but in Persepolis, what she did, same thing. She went into the animated space and created a poetic visual representation of all of the different elements and then put them into a linear narrative. And that is what mapping also does, is it takes things and allows them to be seen on multiple levels by different people. And that's also what these video chats do. I would prefer that we not, again, look at these slot machines as something that only disconnect us, because again, that seems to come up as a kind of caution. And I understand it as a caution, but perceptively, we would not have the same level of conversation if we only had voice. And we also would not have the same level of conversation if we only had email. And we definitely would not have the same level of conversation if we only had written letters or peer-reviewed papers, etc., with which to engage. So in terms of our own evolution as individuals and collectives, I think that what everyone's bringing up is really the sort of the grist of what, that's where we are evolutionarily. And that's just, I just want to point that out. Holodex, excellent. Yay.
A brief side note to what Mariette just said. I think we tend to underestimate the power of just voice and the old phone call, because voice contains tremendous emotional valence. And one of the problems with adding video is that I'm looking at Mariette's image in the middle of my screen right now. I'm not looking at the lens of the camera. And humans are very good at telling where your eyes are looking. Like if you're standing in front of somebody, you can tell that they're looking at your forehead or or the tip of your nose or the tip of your chin. You can tell. And so it kind of breaks the human connection to do the video thing a bit, because you see a lot of animation, you see distractions, you see a bunch of other stuff. So it's complicated when you start bringing in video, even though it's richer, and the screen sharing is a whole new thing. It's like an added dimension. But just voice is extremely intimate. You can whisper and you can be closer to somebody than they would let you in front, if you were standing next to each other. you can be more intimate on just audio than in person in some ways. It's very cool.
I'm also really interested in this group of the possibility of using breakout rooms, and like if we went into a game shifting mode, having a place where 2 or 3 people could stay talking, and another group could go in to a screen share mapping active collaborative space. I think we can only leave one recording. But then we could share the map from the other one and share the recording from the voice one. Although that's, again, more time that none of us have. But I think there's a huge amount of generative possibilities within this group that we don't always dive into because we don't actually get to explore the connections in a closer way because there's usually, 8, 9 people on the call. So I'm curious about that.
Has anyone thought of using the talk time app to have better control over each of these calls?
We've played with it in the collective. We haven't really played with it here.
I mean, see, one of the reasons why I chat a lot is because ideas come to me as other people are talking. I don't want to lose them because I'll forget them very quickly. So that's just my style. Talk time, like if I had something that I wanted to, I usually wait for somebody for a break in the conversation, so I don't naturally interrupt.
I also liked the talk time. When you do a shared talk time, there's one visual that Joachim put up where you could actually move pins into like where you are in emotional states about a topic, which I thought it was really interesting. The ability to do that coherently with people I'd like to try that. Yeah,
and that actually points to a game shifting board like this thing is it when it's done, it typically has different roles, or at least there's a couple roles that people are playing and you can rotate them and swap it. But one role is kind of like the game maestro or game master, who is the only one that's able to move the, or maybe you could have multiples, but move the sort of indicators on the board to say, well, we've done it where there's one explicit board and then each person has their own board where, you could do that sort of emotional state thing. But it would be the game maestro who would say like, hey, I'm sensing that we're in like a popcorn mode. Everybody's just sort of talking. So you can do it 2 ways, either sort of have the board represent what's naturally happening or intentionally do it like, oh, well, we're going to be strict to this game mode. Like, unless we intentionally shift to popcorn, everybody please stop popcorning. Let's do raise your hand, or let's do something like that.
And how do those game shifting rules translate to the asynchronous spaces? How we use channels, how we use contexts, whether one channel is a high flow or a low flow, what goes there?
Yeah, I guess that would sort of show up as like moderators or moderation of like, hey, technically this doesn't belong in here, and it's just whether or not you're sort of super strict about it, of like, well, okay, they posted something, it doesn't really belong in announcements, but I'll just let it go, versus
you could take the moderator view, but you could also take the like, how do you set the context in the first place as people come in, like the onboarding view, the introductory.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost, weirdly, it comes up to me almost like hashtagging it. I don't know, that's useless, but badges or hashtags. Something that allows people to sort of see the kind of elements involved, perhaps. Again, I don't know, it just seems like people if I read a title, might have one perception of what the conversation is about. Then when I see additional subtitles or category or hashtag type items, I may then be able to use those modifiers in order to really understand what the moderator really wants this to be about. So whatever those sub signifiers, those meta signifiers might be, would maybe be helpful. You know, because are announcements like events, or are they milestones, or what are, you know, are all of these things allowed in the announcement section, for an example? And that might make it more contextually easy for people. Don't know.
I have a comment, question, slash question. So, because I think that depending on the conversation you're having, you would like, of course, you would like different things. And one thing is to have a conversation over a general subject, in which you just want to exchange ideas, so almost a social gathering. Another is a co-creation session in which you want to, there is sort of like a output product. So I don't know if this distinction is binary, but probably it's not. So I'm thinking, how do you define this characteristic of the conversation, of whether it is okay to drift out? And I think this connects with what Maria was saying, or you can drift away, or you have to focus into something. And in a way, it's if you are, I mean, if you just want to talk about stuff in general, it's probably okay to just don't give any limits. But if you want to come up with outputs, what you tend to need for achieving an objective is to start adding constraints. So if the objective is one, you cannot talk about things that are other, I mean, not related to the current subject. And these restrictions that you put into the conversation becomes sort of a symbol of the like the members that are participating in the conversation create a new item, which is this collective that has created on this call, and this agent is like energized by the people who participate. But the thing is that this agent will take an action by its own. It's like you clearly specify what this virtual agent decides out of inputs from the participants. But the thing is that when the conversation is over, you have you have some sort of the concept of finality. So you want to know what the agent said, so the decision that was taken. So if it's a governance, it's the call, then you have a decision. If it is a design call, you have a wireframe, something like that. So, and I see that this, as you move into this conversation, what you're adding is to, limitations to what you can say and what you should not say. And one of the problems that is in these calls is that it's easy to go out and everybody gets something to home, some learning, but sometimes it's hard to get something like a concrete out of it. I don't know if playing like simulating this figure of the virtual agent that creates and saying this agent has a voice, what did he said at the end, and formalize it in a way could help. I know this was ranting at the end, but the scope of the conversation should influence how it is governed and which the rules you put on it.
I think that there's a really interesting thing that's happened with this particular group, because while we talk about whatever we want, like there's no agenda, it's just a community ecosystem mapper call. I think all of us come from wanting to increase sense making and collective intelligence all the time. Like it's almost like we have a meta boundary at the bottom of our conversations instead of a wraparound boundary on like that you would do on a strategic map at the top of our conversations, if that makes sense. Not sure conversations are dimensional, but something like that. I don't know. So it's this call I find fascinating because it's not just like, oh, come meet everybody and have a party and talk about whatever you want. It's like, we can talk about it whatever we want, but you can always hear the thread of people's interest in augmentation, intelligence augmentation, collective sense making, empathy, compassion. Oh, Sophia, in an in-person mapping experiment that we did with, I don't know, there were like 25, 30 people in the room doing 3 different maps. Sophia asked at the end that everybody held when they put a node on the map, that they didn't do it so fast, that they held it with some compassion. Like, why is this here, and what is the context, and what is the best name for this thing that we're trying to name? Like, understanding when you go from the analog to the digital, and holding that with some compassion, which I just thought was fascinating.
What's interesting about that image that you just gave with what Sophia asked for is, to me, it gave me a sense of, many little holons, like all these little complete worlds and things that are so rich that then also, populate infinitely into bigger and bigger pieces, right? And that kind of care is what I think a lot of this group and this call is about. I think that really expresses it. Because what you also just brought forward for me is this idea of coming from the root chakra, right? So this is the place where we don't have to, figure out again how to move the widget from A to C. That's a different call or a different series of calls. This is the place where we actually get the inspiration and the sort of more foundational processes that would allow those things to rise up through us holistically. Again, my general I acquiesce and I recognize that within group, to accomplish things, we have to do certain things, those, in these very linear and again restricted ways. That helps us accomplish certain things. But we actually talk about how are we going to gamify, or how are we going to do these things, we have to also have a field of coherence. And the coherence doesn't come simply from our linear, perspective of we need to accomplish this, because it also then puts a burden on us, and it also makes us think that this work is singularly of this moment, and this work is the beginning of something that then continues for many generations. I mean, it's a whole shift. And so, again, not to make us all feel like we're changing the world forever and ever, amen, but in a way, yes. Because, again, like I've said before, Jerry's brain to me is one of the best examples of what every AI person should be seeking to do, because if they think they're going to get a robot to become an AI, they're wrong. And they're looking at it from the wrong perspective. And again, many of you on this call have been taught as programmers to look at it from that perspective. And I would ask you to kind of understand that, again, as somebody who inhabits a female body, who has often been shut out and shut down by your technologies, that you understand that I'm part of the group that engages with your technology more than the men do. I'm part of the group who can synthesize that in a way that you guys can't, because you were already rewarded for doing it in a linear way, in a top-down fashion. And so I'm offering you this gift, and Sophia's offering you this gift, and Christina's offering you this gift, and Lauren's offering you this gift. And if I could go through this sort of, Jerry and Michael, we're offering this gift of integrated systems thinking. And within that gift, one must be willing to allow for a field of resonance. And if you want to quantify that, have at it. Or maybe in fact that's what we are doing. But that's the thing, I am tired. I'm woefully tired of people saying that what I say is cute. And I'm woefully tired of every time I offer somebody something, they offer me another mail to read. It's not gender-based for me. It's just, I understand. And it's amazing to me that people don't even understand I can have an original thought based on my personal experience, and so can you. If you are only as good as the people you read, If your map is only as good as a bunch of stuff that you throw together because you think it's important, but it has no emotional resonance for you, I'm not interested. But Jerry's map interests the hell out of me. Because not only can I chronologically and all these other ways timestamp and figure out what it is that he's looking at, but I can feel his personal movement, his experiential movement through space and time. And that is metaphysically stronger and meta super strong. So I can categorize and hashtag the shit out of it, but my interest is in experiencing it first. And if you're lucky enough to be a double thinker where you can kind of do both, then that's great, and that's why you're here. That's how I see it. I'm just on fire. Just on fire. And I love you all.
Thank you, Mariette. I like, it's weird. I've been doing this brain thing for 21 years, and you just articulated things that are clearly there for me that I hadn't thought about in that way at all. And like, I have passion about what I'm doing with it. It's not, this is not bookmarks. This is not something else. This is authoring, and this is memorializing, and this is trying to sculpt weird little words and connections into something that might light people up on fire somehow. So I thank you for expressing it so beautifully. I feel like I'm playing with a modern authoring system. and so I experiment a lot with screencasts, and I post them on YouTube. I tweet a lot, I do this, I do that. And I'm trying to write a book, but I hate books because they're serial words. And to me, the book is the impoverished version of the live interactive thing that connects to activities that you could go do. And so I'm really interested in building the connected graph visual thing that we can inhabit and share and improve and negotiate over. And then figure out how to make that work in the world. Because I don't think interactive videos with multiple endings are the answer to the future of literacy and communication.
I agree. I feel like we're halfway there. I can't wait. I keep saying to anybody who talks about AR, like I want to sit down with Philip Sheldrake, have coffee in the morning, you know, while he's having his pint in the afternoon as a hologram. Like, just sit down. Get as much as of the full analog across as possible. We can't even make eye contact. Like, nobody has solved that. It's just silly. Even if you stare at the camera and let people know that you're listening to them, you feel totally disconnected because you're staring at your stupid camera.
Actually, the thing I just realized from playing games such as first-person shooters, if the cameras are our eyes and we have kind of a sort of like an avatar, we really could walk up to somebody's like virtual face and look them right in the eye, and that would be the only person we're looking in the eye in a call. And actually, another little experimental tool that my friend Connor Turlin's created, actually I'll share a link, it's probably not going to work, but it's a sort of adjacent possible in terms of apps, is using an open source library called THU. You can walk around in this space, but instead of walking around as an avatar, you're walking around as a billboard of your webcam, but it would still have that effect of like if two webcams or like billboards are looking at each other, then technically that's what they're looking at because they've decided with their law of 2 feet or law of mobility to move somewhere else. And actually the space has proximal audio, so if somebody's talking way off in the distance, you'll sort of subtly hear them, but if you're actually close to them, you'll hear them better or more loudly. Yeah, obviously these things have been in sort of actual like full-blown video games for years. This is sort of this Matrix Cafe thing. This is sort of just a little hacked together version for now, but it just came to mind.
Well, I have another call in 7 minutes, and I think it's on this line, so we got to roll. But this is always a really fun call. Peppo, I'm so glad that you were able to hop in and join us, and it's on the community calendar. You're welcome any week.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it a lot.
The Mapper Posse.
Many ways it's new for me, so it was great. Thank you.
You're a mapper too, though. You explore context the way you do.
Wouldn't you like to be a mapper? To be a mapper. To be a mapper.
I actually want a different word for mapper. I like navigator. I don't know. People understand maps in so many different ways.
It's sense making one way or another.
I like guide a lot. I use scout and guide are words that really resonate for me.
Mm-hmm.
And the scout is the guide who's sort of out ahead mapping territory and then coming back and saying, this is the safe way, that way not so much. Mm-hmm. And the guide is the experienced person who knows the terrain, the landscape. I love words like terrain, landscape. Those things to me are rich, metaphoric words for what we're doing.
Reconnaissance. What's the derivation of that? Naissance, birth?
Reconnaître is to recognize.
Cool. Well, I will stop recording and you'll be able to
Thanks,
recapture
everybody.
a piece of this later. Bye-bye.
Really fun call. So good.
You still here, Jeremy?